Hello, this is Kathryn.
Hi, this is Chelsea Pennington.
Hey, how are you?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Awesome. Okay. Well, let's get into it. Um, so first, if you'll just say a little bit about yourself and just of your background and how you got into writing, that would be great.
Yeah, so it's not too interesting of a story. I'm a stereotypical kid who was a bookworm and was always chomping at the bit to go to the library every week and started writing my novel in very heavy air quotes when I was 12. But I didn't ever consider being an author an actual possibility. It seemed as far fetched as becoming an astronaut or a president. So I always loved writing and reading, and I knew I wanted to be an English major from the time I was in middle school, but I didn't actually consider getting published until I was in college. And I spent a period of time then drafting my actual first novel, which you'll be familiar with, but during jam term. um, and looked for an agent when I was in college. Happened to sign with an agent the day I turned 20. And from there on out, I've always been in some way involved with the publishing process. So, so I've written children's books and also young adult novels, and it's kind of the dream job. I really love it. I wouldn't trade it for anything in the world, but that mainly happened all around college. And then I sold my first book about a year after graduating and have been writing and getting book deals ever since then.
Awesome. That's cool. So you were kind of young comparatively when you got an agent and everything.
I was, yeah. It's something whenever I talk to teen writers or aspiring teen writers, I tell them I was definitely finishing my first novel and shopping for agents and finding agents when I was still a teen. So it's absolutely still possible. Looking back, there was so much that I wish I'd known then. I was really naive, and I think a lot of the learning process was just trial and error and experience. But yeah, I was really, really fortunate to get into the industry that young.
Cool. Is there anything you want to share as far as advice for other people, especially younger people looking for agents and to be traditionally published?
Yeah, absolutely. Um, I'd suggest first, do your research on your agents. There's been a little bit of drama lately in the publishing community about agents who haven't been acting in the best interest of their clients or been dishonest. So, just try as much as you can to do your research, especially if you're young. It's easier for people to take advantage of you, which it shouldn't be, but it is. So an agent, a true agent, will never charge you money. They will only always work on commission. So their interests will be aligned with yours. When you sell a book, that's the only time that they make money. So that's more practical, nitty gritty industry advice. But on a larger scale, just keep writing and keep reading. The advice that I've heard from fellow authors who are mid-list authors like myself, all the way up to New York Times bestselling authors, is you just have to keep writing. If your book doesn't sell or you don't get an agent, write another one. If it does sell and you do wonderfully and you get all the good reviews, keep writing another book, because that's the only thing as an author you can really control. You can't control cover design or the title of your book or how it's publicized, anything about the marketing plan, but you can control the quality of your words. So persevere, don't give up. It's an industry where you have to develop some thick skin, because even after all the rejections, once you do get in, you'll still get people who just don't like your book. And you just have to be okay with that and keep on keeping on.
Awesome. I love it. If you'll talk a little bit about The House in Poplar Wood, your newest book, which I finished reading a couple of days ago and loved it. It's so much fun.
Oh, yay.
I love it. It's sort of how you came up with the idea, sort of maybe summarize it a little bit for those who haven't read it, and then talk about how you came up with the idea, because it's a really unusual, really fun idea.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you, and I really appreciate you reading the book. That means a lot. But yeah, in a nutshell, it's a macabre folk tale that takes place in rural Tennessee and centers around three middle grade characters, which around like the 12, 13 age range. And Felix and Lee are twin brothers, and they serve death and memory. And Gretchen is the daughter of a summoner, so someone who summons the shades of death, memory, and passion, but she's been kind of blocked out of the family business. And when a local girl dies in town, she's determined to get to the bottom of her murder, which everyone else is passing off as an accident. She joins forces with the brothers, and together they go on adventures. They discover some pretty dark secrets about their town, and they try to break an agreement that kept Lee and Felix from seeing the other's parents. And I was first inspired to write it. Generally, when people ask inspiration for stories, I'm at a loss because it's oftentimes just a hybrid of a lot of different ideas. But with this one, I can actually point to a source of inspiration, and that the Brothers Grimm's tale, there we go, Godfather Death. And it's a really creepy tale, as most Brothers Grimm's tales are, about a young man who serves as an apprentice to death, and he follows him all around as he makes his rounds and reaps lives. And there's this lore that when death stands at the head of the bed, now I don't know if I've got it right, but depending on where he stands, whether it's at the head or the foot of the bed, the person is going to live. And all is going well until the woman that the young apprentice has fallen in love with comes up on Death's appointment list, and he decides to trick Death by turning the bed around. He thinks that Death would be smarter than that, but that's the general idea. And I've always been fascinated by stories about death incarnate and what that says about us as a society at the time. I think it gives a good lens for how we view death, how we view life itself. And so I wanted to write my own story about death himself. And so the mythology sort of sprawled out from there. I also wanted to set a book in Tennessee because I spent a lot of my time growing up in Appalachia, and I grew up in Kentucky. So that region itself means a lot to me. And I also wanted to write a book that is my love letter to autumn. That's what I call The House in Poplar Wood, something that was thoroughly spooky and creepy and felt like it belonged in the month of October. So all of those sources combined inspired me to write the book.
Great, that's awesome. And so thinking of this book and your other middle grade books, the Water and the Wild series, and then I think also your upcoming book, and the title is slipping my mind right now, but they're all sort of a mixing of like a fantastical world with our own, so it's not sort of just a fantasy world. But so what draws you to that type of story? I'm curious.
I think more than anything, they're the kind of stories that I loved at that age. So I generally say that I write the books that I would have needed or wanted as a kid and as a teen. So my young adult tends to be, with the exception of the one that's coming up, very solidly just contemporary realism. And those are the types of books that I liked when I was a teen. But when I was anywhere from 6 to 14, I loved fantasy and just zany, fantastical things. So I gobbled up Lewis Sacker and Roald Dahl and C.S. Lewis, and high fantasies were okay, but I generally gravitated more toward portal fantasies or stories that took place in the real world but had a fantastical element to them. And I think that love and really stuck with me. And so it seemed the most natural thing in the world when I wrote The Water and the Wild, which was my first novel, to kind of emulate the authors who had really inspired me as a kid. So it only made sense that it was this very British-inspired portal fantasy. And that's continued to come from different sources. So, a lot of C.S. Lewis and portal fantasies inspired The Water and the Wild. with this one, authors who are a little darker and creepier, like the Goosebumps series and Roald Dahl, more heavily influenced this book. And then my upcoming book, which is a very weird title, which no one should remember, The Sardines of Strange Street, was really inspired by my love of Spielberg and Jim Henson's darker movies and the sort of 80s. I don't know what was going on in the 80s, but I feel as though we had a lot of really dark, bizarre movies as kids from that period. And so it's more inspired by that. But all of those have the common thread of fantasy occurring in the real world. And I will never cease to be fascinated by how that plays out. So yeah, I don't know how, it was a pretty convoluted answer, but
no, yeah,
that answered the question.
Yeah. And you sort of mentioned this, but so you published both middle grade and YA books, and I'm curious about what you've learned from writing and publishing for two different ages. And does it make it more difficult to find an agent or a publisher, or sort of once you were able to find one that was able to do both?
Yeah, no, great question. So answering your second part first, ever since Harry Potter and the Twilight series, children's literature and YA have exploded. A really huge industry. And so a lot of authors out there, there's some exceptions, but a lot of them tend to represent both middle grade and young adults. Okay. And so when I was querying, I just made sure that the agents I was querying would be able to represent both types of my books. And more than that, within the age demographic, there's genre, and I didn't want to find an agent who was just interested in high epic princess fantasy. Young adult, I wanted one that represented projects that were more contemporary realism. So that was another thing that helped me narrow down the search. But I didn't have a problem really finding a lot of agents who represented both of the demographics and genres that I wanted to write. And then as for the process itself, I find it really refreshing to write. I mean, in some ways there's similarities to the books, but in a lot of ways they're very different projects, my middle grade and my young adult. And it's refreshing during the book process once I come out of a hermit cave having drafted a young adult realist book to dive back into edits for a more fantastical middle grade book. It kind of keeps things fresh, keeps me from wanting to pull my hair out. Most of my middle grades tend to be in third person as well, and that's very different from the first person point of view I generally use for my young adult. So it keeps things interesting, but I think it also helps me to sharpen different writing skills. For example, The House in Poplar Wood is from 3 different perspectives, but those are limited third person point of views. And my upcoming young adult, The Great Unknowable End, is dual point of view, but it's from first person point of view. And I cannot tell you how much more difficult that was to write than The House in Poplar Wood, simply because I had to focus so much more on tone and vocabulary and syntax. And I tried for the longest time to try to make The Great Unknowable End third person because I just didn't want to deal with it. But even that, something as simple as a point of view change is completely different. So it's nice. I feel like I'm kind of teaching myself and learning how to write all over again with every project I do.
Great. So you are mostly traditionally published, but I know the Current and the Cure, the last book in the Water in the Wild series, was self-published. Can you sort of talk about your experiences with the differences between those two and maybe any similarities?
Yeah, absolutely. So The Current and the Cure was kind of born out of a mini tragedy. I got the news that no author wants to hear, which was that The Water in the Wild and The Doorway in the Deep weren't selling well enough for the publishing house to pick up a third book. But the catch of that was that my editor had asked me to end the second book on a cliffhanger. And if you've read the series, it is a literal cliffhanger. There is a cliff involved. And I was getting emails from my 8-year-old readers asking what happened and being so concerned about the protagonist. And I just had to make a decision to finish the series, make the third book my labor of love, because generally one book advance pays for a year of my living expenses. And so that was a lot of work that I knew I wasn't going to be paid for, but it really meant a lot to me to finish the series and finish what I started and make sure that my young readers were not in a perpetual state of suspense. So I started looking into the process, and it's very, very different in many ways from traditional publishing. For one thing, it's a lot quicker. There have been books that I sold traditionally. For example, The House in Poplar Wood was sold in 2014, and it's just now coming out. And other books that are traditionally published can be published in a year. It just all depends on the publishing house's schedule and your editor's schedule and how long it takes the contract to go through, and so many things that you just don't have control over. But with self-publishing, the control is all in your hands, as the name implies, and you can work at a pace that works for you. So that's one advantage that I really like about the process. It did require a lot more work on my end too, though. So I had to self-teach myself Photoshop and InDesign and book formatting, and it was at times a frustrating process, but I can't tell you how rewarding it was to bring the book from an idea, do all the drafting on my own, do all the design on my own, and actually turn it into a finished product. That, I think, was more satisfying than any other publishing experience I've had. I was obviously ecstatic to be traditionally published, and I still am. But I think there's a lot of worth and merit in self-publishing too. I know several authors who self-publish, and it really just depends on what you want out of the process, how much control you want over the process. And I definitely would consider self-publishing. Again, I can't speak to it from, I guess, like a purely, well, because The Current and the Cure was the third book in a series. So I knew that there was going to be a built-in audience of people who would buy it because they wanted the third book in the series. So marketing was different than it would be from a traditional self-publishing standpoint, if that makes sense. But yeah, I found it really rewarding. And, there's some similarities. You're still writing for an audience and still keeping your readership in mind. And I think that's the most important part of both processes. But there certainly was a lot more stress and work, but also control on the self-publishing end.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I know that self-publishing is definitely becoming more and more popular and just really common. So I was curious when I had realized that you had done both, just sort of, hanging about.
Yeah.
That's great.
And it's so much more accessible now.
Right.
In some ways, I'm not a fan of Amazon, but they do have a very intuitive platform for publishing. Really, anyone can do an ebook and now can publish a paperback. And the thing that scared me the most about self-publishing was having to buy a lot of copies and then worry about the logistics of shipping them out. But now there are platforms where they themselves just print them on demand in the warehouse and ship them. And I really am grateful for that. I think it's easier to do now than ever before.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm curious, sort of moving away a little bit from your current books and publishing, but reading your bio, you've traveled quite a bit. You've lived in England and Spain, and I'm curious if that traveling has influenced your writing, and also now living in Austin, how that's influenced. I know one of your YA books, Lucky Few, is set in Austin, so I'm curious if where you live has influenced other books you've worked on.
It definitely has. I think that one of the best things that you can do for yourself as a writer, other than reading, of course, is traveling. And even if you can't travel, because I know that's a privilege, it's a socioeconomic privilege that I had to be able to travel to Europe and to live and work there. But even just going out and meeting new people and putting yourself in positions that you normally wouldn't find yourself in, you can do that wherever you are. And it definitely influenced me. The books that I read as a kid really influenced me on the British end of things. So I went to England partially because I had become so enamored with England because of the books that I read and the BBC miniseries that I watched growing up. So but going there definitely did influence my writing. I was revising The Water in the Wild when I lived in London, and I think you can tell there's a very heavy British and British folklore influence on that series, and I have no doubt that living in London made that happen. And then Spain, my upcoming middle grade, The Sightings of Strange Street, has twins whose parents are from Spain, and so I was able to incorporate a lot of what I learned and knew into that background story. So even things that I didn't think were going to influence my writing tend to crop up because it's lived experience, and I think there's nothing quite like lived experience when you're drafting a novel. And yes, Austin definitely has influenced me. It's my favorite city in the U.S. And I actually wrote Lucky Few when I'd moved away from Austin for the first time, and it was kind of catharsis for me because I missed it so much. And so I was able to engage in a little bit of nostalgia when I was writing it. But yeah, just location in general, one thing that I try to be conscious about when I'm writing my books is to write books that happen in flyover states, because I always felt growing up that they tended to be overlooked. Like, I never read a book where someone lives in Kentucky, and I know that's a lot to ask from authors, but it always seems like books and movies take place either in California or in New York, and there's no in between. So I've tried, Tash Hart's Story takes place in Lexington, Kentucky, my hometown, and The Great and Noble Inn takes place in small town Kansas. Sightings of Strange Street takes place in this little town in Texas. Poplar Wood, of course, takes place in Appalachia. So it was important to me too, just that the places I have been to and visited and fallen in love with are shown on the page. So that was a little bit of a tangent.
No, that's great. Yeah. And I grew up in Texas, in Dallas, so I loved reading your story set.
I
was like, oh,
yay.
That's awesome. That's fun. I get that. So in addition to writing, you also host several podcasts, and I know you've created a web series in the past. So what have you learned from working on these different mediums of storytelling, and how do you balance the work that goes into those and with writing?
Yeah, so something I discovered pretty early on when I got my first book deal, and I had fears about this. I didn't want for writing, which to me had been such a cathartic outlet and enjoyable thing to do whenever I could carve out the spare time for it. I didn't want, if it was going to become a full-time job, for it to suddenly lose its joy, and I didn't want to lose my pleasure in writing. And I'm happy to report that hasn't ever happened. I think when you love something so much, you will just keep on loving it. But I did find that once I was writing full-time, I craved other creative projects to do that weren't dependent on deadlines and reviews and money, because there is a business side of writing that you don't exactly sign up for as an author. It's just part of the part of the game. So pretty early on, I knew that I wanted to have another creative project to be kind of what writing had been to me before, as a different outlet where there weren't any stakes, and I didn't have an editor to report to, and I didn't have to worry about reception, anything like that. So that was one of the many things that went into my decision to make a web series with fellow Stanford grad and YA writer Destiny Soria. And yeah, and so it was a very different experience. One thing I learned quickly was that I much preferred writing books to doing web series. And they're different. I loved my experience doing a web series, but I learned that there was way less control over web series than there even was in the publishing industry, because Destiny and I could co-write like a perfect script, but there was no telling how it was going to end up on video. There were so many different factors that we just didn't have control over, like if the actors were going to give a good performance, or if they had memorized their lines, or if there were technical difficulties, or how many planes were flying overhead when we were shooting outside. So that was a learning experience. It was frustrating because at least when I'm writing, I know that I have complete control over the finished product. And on the one hand, that's scary because if anything's wrong with it, it comes back to me. Like if there's a problem in the novel, if it's just not good, or accepted well, then it all falls back to me. And with web series, there's more shared blame, but there's also less control. So I love the experience. I love the friendships that I made out of it, and the really amazing creative people that I met in the process. Bethany and I did 2 series. We did one when I was first living in Birmingham, and then a couple years later when I returned. And I wouldn't trade that experience for anything. But it taught me a whole lot about filming and logistics. And I'm so glad that we still have stories as a result of what we did. But then I do podcasting now, and podcasting, if you hadn't already guessed from everything I said, I'm a control freak. And podcasting allows me to have a little bit more control. I get to edit the material. And I really loved working in that medium. I do a podcast with my sister, and then another podcast that I just started recently called The Creepover. And they're both kind of obsessed with the macabre and the dark and spooky.
So sort of in light of everything going on culturally now and politically, it's a very controversial, divided time. So why do you think writing and telling stories is still important?
I think it's more important than ever because from my perspective, I think stories develop empathy. Good stories develop empathy. They put you in the shoes of another person with different experiences from you, and they allow you to see the world, however temporarily, through their eyes. So I think it's important more than ever now that we read books from diverse perspectives written by marginalized authors. There's been a really big push for it in the industry, and I hope that it continues to happen, that we read from perspectives of people of color, from people in the queer community, from people who have different cultural experiences than we do, because it's really easy, especially in today's political climate, to just surround yourself with people who think the way you do. I know I'm guilty of it. I think it's a human instinct. And to live inside of an echo chamber where you create an us versus them mentality, and everything's black and white, and you set up strawmen, and you beat them, and you engage with internet trolls, and you don't actually view the world through someone else's perspective. It's really easy to get self-centered. And so I think books are more important than ever because they allow you to break away from that and to step outside of that circle. Hopefully, if you're making choices to read books that you wouldn't necessarily pick up, or just books from a perspective that you've never encountered before. I think they do such a great job of educating and, I don't know, just increasing our humanity. So I think they still have really important work to do. I know I'm biased because I'm a writer, but I wholly believe in the power of stories to transform people's lives and their perspectives.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah, I totally agree. I may also be biased, but I think you're totally
Yes.
So can you tell us a little bit about your next project, whether that's something you're publishing, something you're drafting right now, just kind of whatever you are thinking of as your next project? I'd love to hear whatever you can say.
Yeah, so in 2019, I'll have a YA and a middle grade coming out. And my YA, I'm really excited about. It's very different from the young adult novels I've written before. It's got more of a speculative twist. So it takes place in 1977 and is really inspired by my love of the Twilight Zone. And I had a ton of fun with it. It's my first dual point of view too, like I mentioned before, so I'm also very nervous about it. But I can't wait for it to come out. And then fall of 2019, Disney's publishing my Sardines of Strange Street, which I'm currently editing right now. My computer is open to this track changes document. This interview was a very nice reprieve. And looking into that before, it's this very Spielberg-inspired kind of Stranger Things feeling novel. And it's also very different from middle grade I've written before. It does have that fantastical element, but it's more sci-fi than fantasy or folklore. And it was inspired in equal parts by all those creepy 80s movies and my obsession with hoverboarding and Back to the Future 2 and sports narratives. I'm horrible at sports. So anyone who hears me say this will laugh who knows me. But I love a good sports narrative. There's something so satisfying about watching a team come together and beat the odds and have all this great camaraderie. I was always a sucker for that Disney sports series. Remember the Titans, Miracle, the Rookie. So it's been fun to work on a sports narrative too. It's the first time I've ever done that because I am the least sporty person in the world. But yeah, again, it's been a change in what my normal writing is. And I'm really thrilled for both of those to come out. And I do have some other projects that I'm writing, but I have to keep those under wraps, unfortunately. Hopefully they'll be able to be public soon.
Great. Yeah, I love the sports. I'm totally the same way where I have no interest in watching real sports, but a sports movie or a book, I'm all about it.
Right. So I'm excited. They're just naturally good stakes.
Yeah. It's an underdog. Yeah, it's great.
Yes.
All right. So last two questions. One's a little more practical and one's more fun. So first one, what is sort of your number one resource to use as a writer, whether that's a writing blog or book or a writing program, just something that is sort of your go-to?
Yeah. So I use Scrivener to write and draft most of my novels. I don't know if you're familiar.
Yeah, I just downloaded it, so I'm still figuring it out. Yeah. I've heard a lot about it.
I love it. Yeah, it's essentially a word processing program, but made with authors in mind. And I may have a lot of traditionally right-brain interests, but my brain is more traditionally left-brain in the way that it does things. So I like having organization and being able to see things laid out. So Scrivener really appeals to my dorky self. So it allows you to do basically what the old medieval profession of scrivening was. So taking apart bits of the manuscripts and putting them back together. And it's a great place for me to store my research and my character profiles, an interface where you can add photos and have note cards. And the most satisfying process of all to me is that chapter by chapter, there's an option to tick first draft, revised draft, final draft to do. And as someone who loves the feeling of crossing off things on my to-do list, that is the most satisfying and encouraging thing as an author. Just click revised draft or final draft in the process. So yeah, honestly, it's not hyperbole to say that Scrivener's changed the way that I look at novel writing. Before it was just all one big glob of 80,000 plus words in a Microsoft Word doc. And with Scrivener, I'm able to visualize my novel a lot better. And so when it comes to plot and structural issues, I find it a lot easier to edit when I can see all the chapters before me and more easily visualize what needs to happen to make it a better story.
Yeah, I've heard great things about it, so I'll have to actually get into using it.
Yeah, I'm excited that you have it. It's a little bit of a learning curve.
Yeah.
Some things aren't very intuitive, but I think it's definitely worth using.
Awesome. Yeah, I've been watching videos, so I'm looking forward to it.
Yes.
And then, so of all the books you've written and coming up that are to be published, if you could choose one character to go on a road trip with, who would that be?
It would be Gretchen Whipple from The House in Poplar Wood. I had to think about that. I don't know. I really love Gretchen because she's a lot of what I'm not, but I would want to be. She's just very gutsy and doesn't care who she's not offending, but she's just a very determined character, I should say. And she's not afraid to break windows to get what she wants. And I think that if we went on a road trip, there would be so many good stories to come out of it. So Gretchen, for sure.
Awesome. I love it. All right. Well, I think that is everything I have. Thank you so much for talking with me. This is a lot of fun. And
Of course. Thank